So you picture the flow of information today, right? And your mind probably goes straight to those massive, sterile server farms.
Oh, absolutely. Just endless rows of blinking lights, humongous cooling fans.
Yeah, fiber optic cables just, crisscrossing the ocean floor. It's pure cold infrastructure.
Right.
Routing data from point A to point B without a single thought about what that data actually contains.
Because the servers are entirely agnostic. I mean, they handle the data for a groundbreaking scientific paper on quantum mechanics with the exact same binary indifference as a viral video of a cat falling off a table.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole system is designed to be invisible, automated, and totally devoid of personality.
But imagine if that entire global routing system for the most paradigm-shifting information on Earth was just one guy.
Okay.
And not like a tech billionaire or some massive government agency. Imagine the human equivalent of the internet is a 17th century French friar.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right. A man who took a vow of extreme poverty, living in a tiny, unheated stone cell in Paris, dedicating his entire existence to God.
And we are, of course, talking about Marin Mersenne.
Yes.
He deliberately chose a life of strict seclusion in the Minim order, which was, it was a Franciscan offshoot known for extreme austerity.
Really hardcore austerity.
Oh, intensely restricted diet. Their lives were built entirely around silent prayer and contemplation. And yet from that tiny cell, he somehow became the most connected human being in the world. He literally operated as the central routing node for the absolute greatest minds of the scientific revolution.
We're talking René Descartes, Galileo, Blaise Pascal, Thomas Hobbes.
All the heavyweights.
If you wanted your ideas read by the intellectual elite of the era, or, if you wanted to know what those heavyweights were currently working on, you had to route your letters through this devout monk.
You had no other choice.
So the mission for our deep dive into the sources today is to figure out the actual mechanics of how Mersenne pulled this off. We need to look at how he managed the flow of this really dangerous information during the volatile birth of modern science.
Because it was incredibly dangerous.
Right. And how he attempted to weaponize mathematics against heresy, and how ultimately his own desperate struggle with philosophical skepticism accidentally laid the groundwork for modern experimental physics.
It's a huge journey. And, the landscape of the early 1600s is almost incomprehensible to us now in terms of information scarcity.
Oh, for sure.
There was an absolute vacuum of scientific infrastructure. No academic journals, no peer review systems, no university research laboratories.
Nothing.
If you were a natural philosopher with a radical new idea about how the solar system functioned, you were completely isolated.
And isolation back then wasn't just, a matter of professional obscurity. It was physically dangerous. Because France was just emerging from half a century of brutal, blood-soaked religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots. So proposing a new idea about the universe.
Especially one that contradicted the accepted Aristotelian worldview backed by the church.
Exactly. That could easily get you branded a heretic. Right. I mean, the shadow of Giordano Bruno.
Right, who was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600 for his cosmological ideas.
Yeah, that hung heavily over every thinker in Europe.
Yeah.
You didn't just tweet your radical theories.
No, you kept them very quiet. And into this highly paranoid, fragmented void steps Mersenne.
Right.
He was actually born in 1588 to a family of laborers, but he managed to get an elite education at the Jesuit College of La Flèche.
Which is a huge detail.
It's critical, because La Flèche is the exact same institution where a slightly younger René Descartes was being educated.
Oh, wow. So they knew each other.
Or at least they shared the exact same rigorous grounding in classical logic, theology, and mathematics.
They spoke the same intellectual language.
Exactly. So after La Flèche, Mersenne eventually joins the Minims and settles into their convent near the Place Royale in Paris around 1619.
Okay.
And he basically just sits down at his desk and starts writing letters.
Which sounds simple, but the physical reality of maintaining a correspondence network in the 1620s is daunting.
It's a nightmare.
You are dealing with expensive paper, hand-mixed ink, and you're completely reliant on independent couriers or like the nascent postal systems of royal courts.
Which were not reliable.
At all. A letter from Paris to Amsterdam could take weeks, and there was always the risk of it being intercepted by political spies.
Or the Inquisition.
Or simply just lost in a ditch somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. But despite all those hurdles, the volume he produced is staggering. The sources indicate we have 146 surviving letters just from Descartes to Mersenne.
Just from Descartes?
Yeah. That represents roughly a quarter of Descartes' entire known correspondence.
That's insane.
When Descartes goes into self-imposed exile in the Dutch Republic to just, work in peace away from society, Mersenne becomes his absolute gatekeeper.
Like his agent, almost.
Very much so. If you wanted to know where Descartes was living because he moved constantly to avoid visitors, you had to write to Mersenne and ask for the address.
And Mersenne wasn't just passively forwarding sealed envelopes, right? He was opening them.
Oh, he was definitely reading them.
He was translating them, copying them by hand, and sending them back out. I mean, he translated Galileo's revolutionary work on mechanics from Italian so the French scholars could actually read it.
Which was a massive service to the scientific community.
Huge. And he was corresponding with English philosophers like Hobbes, bridging the gap between the empiricism developing in England and the rationalism developing on the continent.
He was actively orchestrating the intellectual agenda of Europe. He utilized this method of sending out what were known as fine questions.
Okay, what were those?
So he would formulate a highly complex mathematical or physical problem, and then he'd mail it out to his networks simultaneously.
Like a mass email.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Turning the European intellectual community into a massive distributed processing machine. He wanted to see who could solve it first, or, how different thinkers approached the exact same problem.
Right, and the most famous example of this from the sources is the search for what mathematicians today still call Mersenne primes.
Right.
A prime number, just to recap for you listening, is a number only divisible by 1 and itself. And Mersenne posed a question to his network about primes that can be expressed as 2 to the power of n minus 1.
Okay.
So n is 3, 2 to the power of 3 is 8, minus 1 is 7, and 7 is a prime number.
Got it. And he provided a list of these specific primes for exponents up to 257.
Which is?
It's mind-boggling. The sheer brute force arithmetic required to verify those numbers by hand using only the mathematical tools available in the 1630s.
Because they didn't have calculators.
No. He had to manually calculate these massive integers and then systematically attempt to divide them by every smaller prime to prove they had no other factors.
That sounds like a form of torture.
I mean, he was an ascetic monk. Maybe he enjoyed the suffering. He actually made a few errors in his list, which frankly weren't discovered until the invention of mechanical calculators centuries later.
Really?
Yeah. But the formula he championed remains foundational. Today, the largest known prime numbers in the world, the ones used to secure our modern cryptographic systems, are almost exclusively Mersenne primes.
Wow. He also instigated the roulette problem. Right? Calculating the curve traced by a point on the rim of a rolling circle, known as a cycloid.
A nightmare of a geometry problem.
A little nightmare. And he just threw it at his network.
Yeah.
It was eventually solved by Roberval in 1634. But Mersenne didn't just say, great problem solved.
No, of course not.
He took Roberval's solution and immediately sent it out to Fermat and Descartes just to provoke them into finding better, more elegant proofs.
Because he knew exactly how to manipulate the immense egos of these men.
Totally.
By around 1633, he formalized this network by hosting weekly Thursday meetings in his Parisian convent. He brought together these brilliant, highly volatile minds.
Who are they?
Etienne Pascal, his teenage prodigy son, Blaise Pascal, Pierre de Fermat, Claude Midorge. They called it the Academia Parisiensis.
So try to picture the scene in that tiny stone cell for a second. You have Blaise Pascal, who go on to invent an early mechanical calculator and literally revolutionize probability theory.
Yeah.
And he's arguing over geometric proofs with Fermat, who was basically a lawyer who did world-changing mathematics in his spare time.
Right.
And Mersenne is just sitting there in his rough friar's habit, mediating these massive disputes. I mean, this informal gathering was the direct prototype for the French Academy of Sciences.
And because he was dealing with such intense personalities, the mediation often spilled over into outright drama.
Go a bit.
Mersenne could be incredibly indiscreet, sometimes deliberately so. The sources detail a major falling out between Descartes and Isaac Beeckman.
Oh, the Beeckman drama.
Yeah. Beeckman was an older Dutch scholar who had mentored Descartes early on, and Beeckman made the mistake of boasting in a private letter that he had essentially taught Descartes everything he knew.
Oh, no.
And Mersenne leaked that letter directly to Descartes.
Which is just so chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
Descartes, whose entire philosophical brand was built on the idea that he figured out the universe from scratch entirely by himself.
Sitting alone in an oven, basically.
He absolutely erupted. He wrote vicious, insulting letters back to Beeckman, permanently severing their relationship.
Burned the bridge entirely.
And Mersenne just stood back and watched the fireworks. He was totally willing to sacrifice personal relationships if it meant stirring the pot and forcing these thinkers to aggressively defend and publish their ideas.
But we have to step back and ask, why is a devout ascetic friar dedicating his life to calculating prime numbers and instigating feuds between secular mathematicians?
Right. It seems totally out of character for a monk.
The answer lies in his early career, back in the 1620s. Science, for Mersenne, did not start as some abstract pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. It was a weapon of orthodoxy.
Okay, a weapon. Let's dig into that.
So France is trying to stabilize as a Catholic state, and Mersenne looks around and just sees threats everywhere. He compiles this massive list of ideological enemies.
Who's on the list?
Atheists, deists, alchemists, Kabbalists, and Renaissance naturalists like Robert Fludd. To Mersenne, these heterodox philosophies weren't just academically incorrect, they were actively dissolving the social and spiritual fabric of Europe.
Because the deists, for instance, they argue that God created the universe like a clockmaker.
Right.
Wound it up and then just walked away.
Exactly, meaning miracles and divine intervention were logically impossible in their view.
And the alchemists believed the universe was infused with hidden magical sympathies and spirits that humans could manipulate.
Right, which sounds like witchcraft to the church. So to combat this, in 1623, Mersenne publishes a colossal text called Questiones Celeberrimae in Genesim, the most famous questions on Genesis.
And this thing is massive.
It is 1,900 folio columns long.
Wow.
It is ostensibly a theological commentary on the early chapters of the book of Genesis, but it is actually a massive encyclopedic defense of Catholic orthodoxy utilizing cutting-edge science.
Is flexing his scientific knowledge to protect the Bible.
Exactly. And he follows it up in 1624 with L'Impiété des Déis, taking direct aim at the deist.
His strategy here is honestly brilliant. Because the deists and the naturalists were claiming the high ground of reason, right? Portraying traditional religion as this superstitious relic of the Dark Ages.
Yeah, that was our whole brand.
So Mersenne decides, I'm going to take reason back. He weaponizes scientific calculation to prove that the Bible is physically and logically consistent. The most famous example from the sources is his calculation of Noah's Ark.
Oh, this is fascinating. He doesn't just say the ark existed because the Bible says so. He treats the ark as a literal engineering problem.
Right.
He takes the biblical dimensions 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, and translates those into contemporary French measurements.
Okay.
He then systematically categorizes every known species of animal based on the current biological knowledge of the 1620s.
Wait, he literally lists out all the animals.
He does, and he calculates the physical volume required for the animals themselves, the immense volume of food and fresh water required to sustain them for a whole year.
And the dung. We can't forget the dung.
Right. The cubic space required for all the animal waste they would produce, and the structural draft of the wooden hull to ensure the whole thing wouldn't capsize under the shifting weight of all that cargo.
That is just, it's incredibly thorough.
He uses mechanics and biology to prove to the skeptics that the Ark wasn't some fairy tale, it was a mathematically viable vessel. He applied this same rigorous standard to optics too, right? Because charlatans and, purported magicians were using early optical tricks to fake miracle.
Yeah, things like camera obscura techniques or strategically placed concave mirrors to project images of spirits or angels onto smoke or walls. It tricked the gullible.
But Mersenne had mastered the contemporary science of refraction and focal points. So he used geometry to literally trace the light paths.
So he could look at an alleged miraculous apparition and say, based on the angle of projection and the focal point, there must be a hidden lens exactly 10 feet away behind that curtain.
Busted.
But he did this specifically to clear the board of fakes. He wanted to ensure that when an event occurred that absolutely defied the known geometric laws of optics, the church could definitively point to it and say, now this is a genuine divine miracle.
Because it broke the math.
Exactly. He was building what he called the Christian Euclid. Okay, unpacking that Euclid is the ancient Greek father of geometry, right? The guy who built his entire system on a few self-evident axioms from which all complex truths could be logically deduced.
Right. And Mersenne believed that the rigorous, undeniable logic of mathematics could be used to make the profound, seemingly irrational mysteries of the divine comprehensible to the human mind.
The geometric analogy he uses for the Holy Trinity in the sources is honestly beautiful.
Oh, the point and the line.
Yes. He argues that God the Father is the geometric point. The point is the foundation of all geometry, right? Yet it has no dimensions, no parts, and is perfectly simple.
Right.
Then the point, through its movement, engenders the line, which represents God the Son.
Okay.
The point and the line then interact to create surfaces, which represents the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And from those surfaces, three-dimensional bodies are generated, representing the physical creation of the entire universe.
It is a conceptually brilliant way to map the eternal onto the spatial, but the underlying assumption there is what really matters. Mathematics is the language God used to write the universe.
But hold on, if you use math and physics to explain away the mechanical hurdles of miracles, like if you are spending months calculating the exact buoyancy and dung capacity of Noah's Ark, aren't you inevitably stripping the sacred mystery out of religion?
That's the risk, isn't it?
Yeah. If God can be explained with a ruler, a compass, and a ledger of cubic volume, do you even need faith anymore? Isn't Mersenne falling into the exact same trap as the naturalists he's tried to destroy?
Mersenne was acutely aware of that exact danger. His defense was very nuanced. He argued that a shallow understanding of science leads to atheism, but a deep, rigorous understanding of science leads inevitably back to faith.
Okay, how so?
If you only know basic optics, you might dismiss every single miracle as a trick of the light. But if you become an absolute master of optics, you eventually reach the hard limits of what physical light can mathematically do.
Right.
When you hit that limit, and phenomena still exist beyond it, you have found the undeniable footprint of the divine.
So reason doesn't replace faith. Reason basically clears the brush away, so faith has a clean, solid foundation to stand on.
Exactly. But he drew a very hard line against the deists' anthropomorphism. The deists believed human reason could fully comprehend the mind of God.
And Mersenne hated that.
He insisted this was arrogant nonsense. Human minds are finite. God is infinite. We can use math to appreciate the staggering architecture of God's physical creation, but we can never presume to understand the inner workings of the architect himself.
This insistence on defending God's ultimate power forces Mersenne into a really dangerous theological corner, though.
It does.
He has to grapple with the absolute limits of reality. In these massive apologetic works, he outlines 35 distinct rational proofs for the existence of God.
35.
Yeah. He uses cosmological arguments pointing out that the physical universe is contingent, meaning it didn't strictly have to exist. Therefore, something necessary and eternal must have sparked its existence.
Right, the prime mover concept.
He also uses variations of the Anselmian ontological argument, which is, that if human beings who are imperfect can conceive of a being possessing all perfections, that being must exist because existence itself is a perfection.
But the absolute cornerstone of his defense relies heavily on a theological concept called voluntarism. And this is the battleground where the future of science is actually decided.
Okay, let's get into voluntarism.
Voluntarism asserts that God's will is entirely distinct from his power.
In what, exactly?
Well, if God is all-powerful, his power is infinite, right? He has the raw capability to create a universe of infinite size with infinite variations of physical laws.
Yeah.
But voluntarism argues that God freely chose, through a deliberate act of his divine will, to create this specific finite universe with these specific physical laws.
Ah, okay.
This was Mersenne's primary weapon against Giordano Bruno. Bruno had argued for an infinite universe filled with infinite worlds.
And Mersenne hated that idea because
if God's nature is infinite and he creates an infinite universe, it implies that the universe is just an automatic emanation of God's nature. It implies necessity.
And if God had to create the universe the way it is, then God doesn't actually have free will. He's just like a passive fountain overflowing with reality.
Exactly. Mersenne needs a God who makes deliberate, artistic choices.
Under Mersenne's voluntarism, the physical reality we inhabit is entirely contingent. It's an arbitrary choice. God could have made gravity push things apart instead of pulling them together. He could have made light travel at a walking pace.
Yeah.
He just chose not to.
Yeah, think of it like a video game developer.
I love this analogy.
The developer sits down and writes the physics engine for the game, how high a character jumps, how fast an object accelerates when dropped.
Right.
The developer could have written a completely different physics engine, but they freely chose this specific set of rules. The characters inside the game have to abide by the rules, but the rules themselves are completely contingent on the developer's whim.
That analogy holds up beautifully until we get to the events of 1630.
Oh yes, Descartes enters the chat.
Mersenne receives a series of letters from Descartes that just completely derail this theological framework.
Yeah.
Because Descartes takes the concept of voluntarism to an extreme that genuinely horrifies Mersenne.
He really does.
Descartes essentially says, I agree that God freely chose the physics engine of the universe, but God also freely chose the underlying binary code. God created the eternal mathematical truths.
Right. Descartes is arguing that truths like 2 + 2 = 4, or the geometric law that all radii of a circle are equal, are not absolute necessities.
Those are mind-bending.
He is saying God created those mathematical laws the same way a human king lays down tax laws in his kingdom. They are arbitrary.
Descartes claims that God is so absolutely powerful that he could have created a universe where the radii of a circle are not equal. He could have willed a universe where 2 + 2 = 5.
Because to Descartes, placing any limit on God, even the limit of basic logic, is an insult to divine omnipotence.
And Mersenne rejects this entirely. He subscribes to a concept called exemplarism.
Right.
For Mersenne, mathematical truths are not arbitrary rules that God invented one day. Mathematical truths are co-eternal with God's intellect. They are the uncreated rays of divine light.
Mersenne argues that God is perfectly logical. To say God could make a square circle is a logical contradiction, and a perfect being cannot engage in contradiction because contradiction is a defect.
Makes sense.
Therefore, mathematics is the actual essence of God's mind.
Because if Descartes is right, the universe is terrifyingly arbitrary. We could wake up tomorrow, and the king of the universe might have changed his mind, and suddenly triangles have 4 sides.
Right, the whole foundation of science just dissolves into absolute uncertainty.
But if Mersenne is right, and math is the eternal architecture of God's mind, then mathematics is the highest, purest science possible. It is the one tool humans have that guarantees absolute truth.
But and this is the turning point. This debate triggers a massive epistemological crisis for Mersenne.
Why? If he wins the argument, isn't he safe?
Because even if he wins the argument, even if mathematical logic is eternal and unchanging, he still believes in voluntarism regarding the physical world.
Right.
God still freely chose the specific physical law out of an infinite menu of possibilities.
So if God could have designed the physical universe in a million different ways, how can a human philosopher just sit in an armchair, close their eyes, and logically deduce how the world works just by thinking about it?
You can't. You can't just reason your way to the laws of physics if those laws were an arbitrary choice made by an infinite being.
So this crisis forces Mersenne to completely reinvent his approach to knowledge. And we see this play out in his 1625 book, La Vérité des Sciences, or The Truth of the Sciences.
Yes, this book is pivotal.
He structures it as a philosophical dialogue between 3 characters. There's an alchemist who represents a dogmatist who thinks he knows the hidden secrets of nature.
Yep.
There's a skeptic who represents the ancient philosophy of doubting literally everything, and a Christian philosopher who clearly serves as Mersenne's mouthpiece.
And the skeptic character brings out the heavy artillery of ancient philosophy. He deploys the 10 classical tropes of antecedentist.
Which are what, exactly?
They are a systematic dismantling of human perception. They are essentially thought experiments designed to prove that your senses are constantly lying to you.
Give me an example.
So the tropes point out that a cup of lukewarm water feels freezing cold if you have a high fever, but it feels pleasantly warm if you just walked in from the snow.
Right.
The water hasn't changed, but your perception is entirely dictated by your physical state.
Or like optical illusions.
Exactly. A square tower viewed from a mile away appears completely round. An oar dipped into a clear lake looks violently bent due to the refraction of light through the water.
So the skeptic argues that because our perception is fundamentally held hostage by our distance, our health, the lighting, and our biology, we have absolutely zero access to the true essence of the objects we are looking at.
We are trapped in our own heads. We only ever experience our flawed internal interpretation of the object.
And the alchemist, I assume, furiously argues back.
Oh, yeah. Claiming he has the philosophical tools to pierce through the illusion and understand the deep, essential nature of matter.
But the twist in the book, and this is what blew my mind in the sources, is that the Christian philosopher, Mersenne himself, actually sides with the skeptic.
He does. The devout Orthodox friar admits defeat. He agrees that human beings can never, ever know the true essences or the ultimate hidden causes of physical reality.
This is a seismic shift. He is looking at the traditional Aristotelians in the universities, who spend their entire lives trying to define the essential nature of a rock or a tree, and he tells them they are wasting their time.
Yep.
He looks at Francis Bacon across the channel, who believed humans could achieve perfect, total knowledge of the universe if they just categorized enough data, and Mersenne basically says, you are delusional. Our finite minds are fundamentally incapable of perfect knowledge.
Historians refer to this pivot as mitigated skepticism. Or probabilism.
Mitigated skepticism.
Right. Because Mersenne accepts the skeptical premise, but he refuses to fall into the nihilistic despair that usually follows it. He introduces a brilliant counter-argument rooted in the theology of St. Augustine.
How does he get out of the trap?
Mersenne tells the skeptic, "Okay, you have proven that my senses deceive me, but the very fact that I know my senses are deceiving me proves that I possess a capacity to recognize truth.
Oh, wow.
If I am aware that I am doubting, I must know with absolute mathematical certainty that I am in a state of doubt."
He is establishing that human beings have a baseline capacity for truth. We exist, we doubt, and we can recognize basic mathematical ratios.
Exactly. And this argument directly foreshadows Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which Descartes would publish years later.
So Mersenne uses this baseline of truth to forge a completely new scientific compromise. He essentially tells the intellectual community, stop arguing about what gravity fundamentally is.
Right. Stop debating whether it is a magnetic sympathy or some spiritual desire of the rock to return to the center of the earth.
We will never know the essence of gravity. Instead, accept that we can only see the surface effects of reality. So let's just use math to measure exactly how fast the rock falls.
It's brilliant. He invents the physico-mathematical approach. It is the birth of early positivism.
He's giving scientists the philosophical permission to create rigorous mathematical models of how the world behaves, while entirely ignoring the metaphysical guts of the machine.
Because it's highly pragmatic. If you can mathematically model how a lens bends light, you can build a telescope to map the stars. And it simply doesn't matter that you don't understand the ultimate ontological essence of light itself.
But this pragmatic compromise has a massive practical consequence. Because if your only job is to measure the surface effects of reality, you can no longer do science by sitting at a desk reading Aristotle.
No, you have to go out into the physical world and actually measure it.
The monk has to leave his cell, grab a stopwatch or, a water clock in his case, and start dropping heavy objects.
This marks the birth of Mersenne as an experimentalist. As we move into the 1630s, the angry, virulent apologist who wrote 1,900-column takedowns of heretics begins to fade.
He softens.
He really does. He becomes much more tolerant of differing viewpoints. He even begins corresponding actively with Protestant scholars in Calvinist regions, which earns him the slightly derogatory nickname, the Huguenot monk, among his stricter Catholic peers.
His entire worldview has shifted to this new practical philosophy. He explicitly writes, we only know the real reasons for things that we can create with our hand and our mind.
Right. And since humans didn't create the universe, we can't know its real reasons.
But we can create experiments.
Yes. And because of his belief in voluntarism, because God freely chose the laws of physics out of infinite possibilities, you cannot deduce physical laws purely through logic. You have to physically interrogate the universe to see what God actually decided to do.
So Mersenne starts rigorously testing the theories of the very geniuses he is corresponding with, most notably Galileo.
Ah, Galileo.
Galileo had published these beautiful, elegant, purely mathematical theorems regarding how objects accelerate during free fall and how projectiles move in parabolic arcs, and Galileo's math was pristine.
It was perfect, on paper.
Right. But when Mersenne actually builds the inclined planes, rolls the bronze balls down them, and measures the time, the physical data does not perfectly line up with Galileo's equations.
And this is where the friction between theoretical and applied physics really begins. Galileo was operating in the realm of pure geometry. He was doing math in a frictionless vacuum that didn't exist in reality.
And Mersenne was the guy in the actual laboratory dealing with the messiness of the physical world.
He realized that pure mathematics applied blindly to the physical world is a total fantasy.
Mersenne points out that Galileo's perfect equations completely ignore air resistance. They ignore the friction of the ball against the wood. They ignore the minute instrumental errors in the water clocks used to measure the time.
Exactly. Mersenne insists on inductive, generalized descriptions of physical events that account for the chaotic, sticky reality of the world, rather than trying to force the world to fit into an elegant abstraction.
Mersenne was comfortable in that frustrating gray area between mathematical perfection and physical reality. He saw that you could run an experiment 10 times and get slightly different data each time.
Which meant relying purely on observation was dangerous, but relying purely on abstract math was equally flawed. You needed both, constantly checking each other.
But there was one specific field of study where the messy physical mechanics of the real world and the beautiful, eternal mathematical ratios of God's mind aligned almost perfectly for Mersenne.
And it became his absolute obsession.
It was the science of acoustics and music.
Yes. This culminates in his absolute magnum opus, published between 1636 and 1637, titled Harmonie Universelle, or Universal Harmony.
And this thing is an encyclopedic, exhaustive study of sound.
He is essentially establishing the foundational laws of acoustics. He studies how the pitch of a vibrating string changes based on 3 specific variables.
What are they?
The length of the string, the tension applied to the string, and the mass or thickness of the string. He establishes that frequency is inversely proportional to length, proportional to the square root of tension, and inversely proportional to the square root of mass. These are literally still known today as Mersenne's laws of strings.
Wow. He was building on the acoustic work of his contemporary Isaac Beekman and others, but Mersenne brought an unprecedented level of rigorous experimental verification to the math.
He did, but once again he ran into the exact same problem he had with Galileo. The pure, ancient mathematics didn't perfectly match the physical reality of human hearing.
Right, because for over 1,000 years, the absolute authority on musical harmony was the ancient Greek mathematician Pythagoras.
Pythagoras had stated that musical harmony is based on simple, perfect integer ratios. He claimed that the perfect octave, the most fundamental harmonic interval, is produced by a ratio of exactly 1:4 in terms of tension.
It's clean, it's logical, it is perfect pure math.
But when Mersenne meticulously tested this by hanging actual lead weights off of physical gut strings, he found a discrepancy.
You couldn't get the 1:4 ratio to sound right.
No. To produce an octave that the human ear actually registers as perfectly in tune, the tension ratio wasn't 1:4. It was roughly 1:4.25.
Why?
Because Pythagoras was doing math on an imaginary, perfectly flexible, one-dimensional geometric line. Mersenne was dealing with a physical string made of sheep gut.
So the physical material matters.
Exactly. That physical string has inherent stiffness. It resists bending at the points where it is anchored to the instrument.
Oh, I see.
That stiffness acts as an artificial tension, raising the frequency of the string higher than the pure math dictates. To compensate for the stiffness and get the correct pitch, you have to adjust the physical tension to 1:4.25.
It is the ultimate vindication of his mitigated skepticism. The pure reason of the isolated mind says the answer must be 1:4.
But the empirical reality of the physical ear interacting with the physical world says it is 1:4.25.
Music, for Mersenne, was the ultimate mixed mathematical science. It forced the abstract eternal truths to reconcile with the contingent physical reality of God's creation.
It really was.
But I have to point out what seems like a glaring contradiction in his life's work.
Okay, what's up?
He just spent a decade writing philosophical treatises proving that human beings are fundamentally incapable of knowing the true essence or ultimate nature of the universe because our minds are finite and our senses are flawed.
Yes.
But then he titles his book Universal Harmony and claims that music represents the exact hierarchy of divine creation.
I see what you mean.
How is a guitar chord theological? Isn't he suddenly claiming to know the hidden metaphysical secrets he just told the alchemists they couldn't possibly know?
It looks like a massive contradiction, but it actually reveals the absolute core of who Marin Mersenne was and how he synthesized his entire life.
Explain that.
He never abandoned his theological mission to defend the Catholic faith. The virulent scientific apologetics of his youth didn't disappear, it just matured. He realized that claiming you knew exactly how God operated the universe was arrogant and scientifically useless. But he believed that meticulously measuring the physical world, finding those mathematical ratios vibrating in a lute string, was a humble, reliable way to catch a distant echo of the Creator's mind.
So for Mersenne, consonance, the fact that certain frequencies sound pleasing and agreeable to the human ear, was not just some biological accident, it was a theological map.
Exactly. He believed the most perfect consonance is unison. 2 strings vibrating at the exact same frequency. Unison represents the absolute undivided unity of God.
Oh, that's beautiful.
As you move away from unison into other harmonic intervals, the octave, the perfect fifth, the major third, the math becomes slightly more complex, and the harmony represents the hierarchy of physical creation emanating outward from the divine center.
He believed music was the ultimate unifier. It united mechanics, the physical movement of air molecules and vibrating mass. It united mathematics, the eternal ratios. It united physiology, the biological mechanism of the human eardrum. And it united theology, the elevation of the human soul when it experiences beauty.
He actually theorized that all sciences, from planetary motion to biology, could technically be represented by sound because everything in the universe is ultimately constructed of weight, number, and measure.
So measuring the 1 to 4.25 ratio wasn't him claiming to know the inner essence of God. It was simply reading the poetry God left behind in the physical world.
Precisely. Mersenne found a way to be a rigorously skeptical, data-driven experimentalist without ever losing his profound awe of the divine.
It is an incredible character arc. He starts in the 1620s as this defensive, angry apologist trying to literally calculate the dung capacity of Noah's Ark to crush atheists in a theological debate.
And through his relentless correspondence and his confrontation with his own intellectual limits, he evolves.
He really does. He becomes a pioneering, collaborative scientist who sees the face of God not in a sterile geometric proof, but in the physical, measurable vibrations of a musical string.
And by doing so, he facilitated that exact same evolution for the entirety of learned Europe. He created the network that allowed the scientific revolution to organize itself.
So what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, navigating your own flood of information today? Looking at Mersenne's legacy, it is abundantly clear he was so much more than just a human router for the geniuses of his era.
Oh, definitely.
His great philosophical compromise, the realization that we can mathematically model the effects of nature, even if we are totally blind to its ultimate causes, was the key that unlocked the modern scientific method.
It changed everything.
He proved that you don't need to have all the answers yourself. You can organize a global revolution of thought simply by finding the right people, managing the flow of their ideas, and asking them the right, perfectly calibrated questions.
But there is a final lingering thought here about the long-term consequences of his compromise.
Let's hear it.
Mersenne successfully used his mitigated skepticism to build a protective firewall around religion. He separated the divine why from the physical how. He told the scientific community, leave the why to theology and faith and just focus your energy on measuring the how.
Which was incredibly practical at the time. It allowed science to progress rapidly because physicists could just measure gravity or optics without constantly being dragged in front of the Inquisition to defend the metaphysical implications of their math.
It was practical, but here's the provocative thought. By giving scientists the theological and philosophical permission to completely ignore the why and focus entirely on modeling the how, did this devout ascetic friar accidentally lay the foundational blueprint for the entirely secular, materialistic, godless worldview that he originally set out to destroy.
Wow.
If you tell generations of brilliant people that their only job is to measure the mechanics of the machine, eventually they stop asking if there was ever a mechanic who built it.
He routed the data so perfectly and built the scientific infrastructure so well that the network eventually forgot he was even there.
Yeah.
The human server farm in that cold Parisian cell just kept humming, moving the information that would build the modern world, while the monk inside slowly faded into the background.
A fascinating legacy.
Truly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the origins and the limits of your own knowledge, and we'll see you next time.